All right, let's dive into a fascinating legal puzzle that comes straight from the Philippine Supreme Court. It's a story that involves a giant oil company, international airlines, and, millions and millions of pesos. But more than that, it asks a really tricky question. If the person buying something is exempt from tax, does that mean nobody has to pay it? The answer, well, it might not be what you think. And this is really the question at the heart of this entire case. On the surface, it sounds pretty simple, right? If the buyer doesn't have to pay a tax, then no tax gets paid. But in the world of tax law, it's not that simple. The person who physically writes the check to the government isn't always the one who actually bears the cost. And that little distinction, turns out, it's everything.
And believe me, this wasn't just some academic debate. The financial stakes here were absolutely enormous.
Okay, so let's meet the key players in this high-stakes showdown. First up, you've got Pilipinas Shell, the huge petroleum producer. They're selling their products to various international airlines. And here's the key part. Those airlines are, by law, exempt from certain taxes. And then, on the other side of the ring, you have the government's tax collector, the Commissioner of Internal Revenue, or, as we'll call them, the CIR.
So the facts of the case were pretty straightforward. Shell makes jet fuel, they sell it to international airlines. As the producer, Shell paid the required excise taxes directly to the government right up front. But since their customers, the airlines, were tax exempt, Shell thought, hey, we shouldn't have paid that. They believed they were entitled to get that money back. So naturally, they filed for a refund.
And we are not talking about small change here. The amount in question was over 95 million pesos. Initially, the Court of Tax Appeals actually sided with Shell and told the government to pay up. And you can bet the government was not about to let go of 95 million pesos without a serious fight.
And that's what set the stage for this big legal battle. It all boiled down to one fundamental question. Who is the actual taxpayer in this situation? Let's take a look at the two different arguments.
This slide lays out the two opposing views perfectly. On one side, Shell's argument was pretty simple. They said, look, the law makes the jet fuel itself tax-exempt when you sell it to an airline. So the exemption is attached to the goods. That means we, Shell, never should have paid the tax in the first place, and it was a mistake. But the CIR, the taxman, had a completely different interpretation. They argued that the tax is on the producer, that's Shell. The legal responsibility, the liability to pay the tax falls on Shell the second that fuel is made. The airline's exemption, that just protects the airline from having the cost passed on to them. It protects the buyer, not the seller. So with two completely different ways of reading the same law, you know where this had to go. The case inevitably landed in the highest court in the land for a final, binding decision.
So yeah, the Commissioner of Internal Revenue was not happy at all with that tax court decision. They appealed, taking this 95 million peso question all the way to the top, to the Supreme Court. So, who was right? Did the exemption follow the product, which would mean Shell gets a refund, or did it just protect the buyer from getting a higher bill? And the Supreme Court sided with the taxman. In a really important decision, the court completely reversed the Court of Tax Appeals and denied Shell's claim for a refund. Flat out. So Shell lost. But the really crucial part of this whole story is why. This is where we get to the heart of it. How did the Supreme Court reach this conclusion? Let's break down their logic.
The court's entire reasoning really hangs on this one key concept, the indirect tax. An excise tax, like the one on fuel, is a textbook example. The law makes one person, in this case the producer Shell, legally liable to pay the tax. But everybody knows that the producer is just going to pass the economic burden of that tax on to the final customer by baking it into the price. This slide really lays out the court's three-step logic perfectly. First, the law is super clear. The excise tax applies to petroleum as soon as it is in existence. That means the tax liability is on Shell, the producer, right away. That's step two. And third, and this is the kicker, the airline's exemption protects them. It's a shield that prevents them from having to shoulder the burden of the tax, but it does absolutely nothing to erase Shell's original liability to pay it in the first place. And hey, you don't just have to take my word for it. Here it is, straight from the court's decision. This one sentence sums up the entire ruling. The tax is the direct liability of the manufacturer, full stop. The manufacturer cannot borrow or use the tax exemption that belongs to its customer. And this all leads us to the biggest takeaway from this case. It's a powerful legal doctrine that really clarifies that huge difference between tax liability and tax burden.
You see, underpinning this whole decision is a fundamental principle of tax law known as strictsimisi juris. It's a Latin term and basically means that tax exemptions are a privilege, not a right. If you're going to ask for an exemption or a refund, the law has to grant it to you in words that are, and I quote, too plain to be mistaken. There's no room for guessing or interpretation, and the law never explicitly gave Shell the right to a refund, so the court couldn't grant one.
So let's just quickly summarize the key lessons here. First, and this is the big one, a buyer's tax exemption is not the seller's exemption. Second, having an exemption protects the buyer from the tax burden, but it doesn't get rid of the seller's tax liability. Third, for excise taxes, that liability kicks in the second the product is made. And finally, you can't just assume you'll get a tax refund. The law has to say so, loud and clear.
And this leaves us with one final thought. This whole case was about a tax that was paid by one company, but ultimately carried by someone else. And it kind of makes you wonder, doesn't it? From the gas in your car to the coffee you bought this morning, what hidden indirect taxes are built into the price of pretty much everything you pay for every single day?